Hi everyone, my name is Maria Golushko and I'm a student here at LSE for a master degree in Public Management and Governance. Today I'll be giving a presentation on strategic thinking and strategic planning and what's the difference between the two. So let's begin. Quickly about me, just as an introduction. I have previously received my bachelor degree and my master degree from the University of Geneva and GIMO respectively prior to coming to LSE. I have then worked in both corporate sector and a private sector, where I've worked a lot on strategy. So when this topic has come up in our managerial courses, it was really quite interesting to me to see the theoretical underlinings of what I've practiced previously as a practitioner. And it was quickly apparent that there is a level of dissonance between the two. Strategic planning and what we do in practice doesn't live up to what initially was intended by strategic thinking. And that's exactly what we will talk today about. We will discuss, first of all, what does current research into managerial practices tell us about strategic planning and strategic thinking. We will then look in detail on what we can do to induce strategic thinking and how it translates into specific managerial approaches. And then I will share some of my professional experience with you of encountering both strategic planning and strategic thinking and the difference between the two. So let's begin by the first one. What does research into current managerial practices tell us about strategic thinking and strategic planning? First of all, where do the terms come from? It was Henry Mintzberg that published his book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning in 1994, where he has defined the two terms. Strategic planning is the articulation or elaboration of strategies that already pre-exist within the firm. So it is more of a planning activity than that of a creative one. Strategic thinking, on the other hand, is about capturing what managers learn from their daily operations, both soft and hard knowledge, and concising that or synthesizing that knowledge into a vision for direction for a firm. So what we have seen for the past, what Henry Mintzberg has noticed that he has seen for the past several decades happening is that strategic planning eventually impeded strategic thinking from taking place and from occurring. And so while it's certainly necessary for strategic thinking to return, he's not advocating for strategic planning to be thrown out altogether, but rather that strategic planning should help strategic thinking in providing them with analysis and hard data that is necessary to make the right conclusions. The second book that is important to mention for this presentation is that by Richard Drumlett, and it's called The Good Strategy, The Bad Strategy, and the Difference and Why It Matters. In that book, Professor Drumlett talks about strategy in general and gives a lot of good examples, but most importantly to me, I think it's important to point out that he says that good strategy is both focused and intentional at the same time, while bad strategy is abstract and rather incremental. So let's try to really understand what is the difference between the two. Specifically, the difference between the two. What are the characteristics? Well, we've already mentioned that one is an analysis and one is synthesis. But more than that, the way that they're produced differs a lot. So under strategic planning, the first one, the usual procedure would be that it's very scheduled and planned in advance. So a corporation or company will have a few days that they will block specifically for strategy generation. There'll be a very clear defined procedure with a mission statement and an assessment, and then finally there'll be an outcome of the strategy that's produced. It's a very regulated process. Under strategic thinking, the process is very different. It's much more intuitive and fluid and creative. It happens through informal communication between managers and the team members. And then a vision for a top manager eventually appears and occurs, and he will then communicate and let it down, and then only formalize it to the public or to his team members. So the two processes are very, very different. And not only the processes are different, but also the content of what you produce is different. Under strategic planning, we're trying to rearrange established categories. So as a result, it becomes very incremental. We're not really questioning what are the categories of our business and how they've come about. We're just saying that we will continue to do more of the same and do it better. So there's often an element of extrapolation from past activities or copying of best practices from competitors. Under strategic thinking, on the other hand, we're creating new categories. We're thinking about why were these categories there in the first place. And when I say categories, I don't just mean categories of product. It could be categories in terms of functions of your firm, or it could be categories in terms of the structure of the firm. And so you would question those and think, why were they created? What role did they play in the previously chosen coherent strategy? And do they serve that same purpose now? So you might still choose to continue strategy, but this time it will be an intentional choice of continuing that one and keeping those categories in place. Surely, though, we're not saying that strategic thinking doesn't look at previous patterns, inconsistencies, and experiences, but instead of just prolonging them, they learn from them and then make a conscious step forward. And finally, the last two differences I'd like to talk about is the outcome that we get at the end of strategic planning and strategic thinking, and the managerial style. The outcome of strategic planning usually will look something like a list of financial goals for the company to take, or like a list of KPIs, where we'll increase our revenue by 20% in the next 3 years. It is usually in big corporations accompanied by short statement of the company's mission. So it will say some very general things that we would like to do better, or the same, provide great customer service and be responsive to our clients, for instance. It is not very specific, and it is basically saying more good in all directions. Under strategic thinking, there is an intentional course of action that's generated. It is much more coherent, there is a reason why it's there, and it was generated with an intent. Now to talk about the managerial style. Under strategic planning, it's a calculating style. So a manager will set up a goal sometime ahead. For example, in 2 years, like I said, let's say we have an increase of revenue by 20%. He will then deduce what each member of the team or each department has to do in order to achieve that goal, and he will prescribe those aims, those KPIs to his responsible managers. Under strategic thinking, it happens very different. Like I've explained, the vision kind of comes about through communicating with your staff and with your managers, and therefore they already know and they're already involved in the process of formulating it. And when you give it back to them, you kind of work out the way to get there with them, which increases enthusiasm of the team a lot because of the ownership of the ideas. So this is really how very specifically we can see the difference between the two and how they're not similar. And while a lot of companies are currently practicing strategic planning, our intention initially was to introduce strategic thinking into the corporate world. So how does strategic thinking translate into managerial practical approaches? In terms of practice, strategic thinking can be demonstrated on the example of scenarios. So what are scenarios? Scenarios are hypotheses, explanatory narratives, ranges of possibilities, or even ranges of differentiating futures. And they're generated and they help us in our strategic thinking by providing us with a horizon of different choices, which we generate by looking at opportunities and different challenges that the future might present. Now we will use these two graphs to understand where scenarios fit into our general managerial approaches. So on the first one, you can see that scenarios are somewhere between stories and models. They are not as exact as models, but they're somewhat more precise than stories. And we say that they're quite plausible. We don't specifically quantify the likelihood of the scenarios, but we say that they're plausible as in they could arrive and they could happen, and those futures could produce themselves. The second graph is there to demonstrate us all the different contexts that are under consideration when we generate our scenarios. So you can see that there is geopolitical trends that we will look at, there is technological trends, and we will try to see what are those trends and what impact they could have on our specific industry. So how exactly do we generate scenarios? What do we do? So in short, scenarios are developed from inputs along key uncertainties, or our axis, that are used to generate plausible, varying explanatory narratives. So what does that mean? Inputs. Let's break this down. So inputs are usually trends or observations that we make from the context that we previously saw. After we identify them, we will try to categorize them along main uncertainties or main drivers of change. from those, we will use them to generate scenarios. So as you can see on the bottom graph, you can either have two axes and then you'll have 4 scenarios around them in a 2D model, or you can have 3 axes of uncertainties and then you can have many more variations of scenarios. Although at the end we still try to stay within 3-4 scenarios, as in to keep them sufficiently different from each other. Once you have your scenarios, you will use scenarios to explore implications that are relevant to your specific firms. So you kind of imagine that future in this quadrant there, and you will talk about, in case that arrives, knowing it's plausible, what would my company do? How would my company survive under those conditions? So let's look at an example. This is a practical application by KPMG, 2030 plus scenarios for energy industry of tomorrow. So as you can see here, we have 2 axes. It's a 2D model. And one is the industry environment, which goes from either a very chaotic environment to a stable one. And the other one is the rate of innovation, which goes from incremental, where quite predictable small changes appear in technology or in innovation, any sort of innovation, to a revolutionary one, something like what we've experienced over the past few decades with technology. So along these 2 axes, we will generate and kind of deduce what the worlds would look like. And you can see that here, under incremental rate of innovation and stable industry environment, consultants have imagined a world of regulated energy and autonomy. And that's what it will look like. And so the company managers would have to look at that scenario and kind of say, okay, given this is the world and this is the future, what role would my company play in it? How would I survive? Would the same functions still be valid? Will the same products still be appealing? And you kind of go through all the different scenarios and you go through the implications of what they mean for your specific business. And then you will probably engage in some sort of cost-benefit analysis upon the actions you can take to prepare for those scenarios. I would like to now talk about my professional experience of encountering both strategic thinking and strategic planning. Let's first of all talk about my experience at KPMG. So the setting was that as a strategy group, we were tasked by a large metals and mining firm to develop a strategy on exploration of a coal depository in the north of Russia. Because there's a lot of construction that take place, we had to do predictions for demand and supply of the coal market and other conditions for 2030. That was happening in 2011. So there's a lot of trying to estimate what the future holds. And we did that using financial models. We're looking at the past experience in this market, what were the main drivers, how did the prices react, and we tried to extrapolate that into the future to give us an idea what 2030 coal market will look like and how the company could prepare for it if they were to explore this depository. As a result, we came up with a strategy, which was, in my opinion today, still a quite valid strategy. However, it was only adapted for one possible future, which assumed incremental change based on trends that we were able to observe in 2011. It wasn't ready for oil market changes that we currently experience. It wasn't adapted for solar technology advances that we can currently observe. So the lesson from there is that very different futures would require very different strategies. And we've developed only one possible strategy for only one possible future, which today, in my opinion, probably wouldn't hold and be much use to that company. On the other hand, I would like to talk about my experience in the private sector, strategic thinking experience that I've had. The setting is very different. So this is a retail sector, fashion retail sector in Moscow, and it's a small team of only 15 people that I was managing. It allowed me much more flexibility in what I was doing, and so I tried to create a culture of cheap testing, which was facilitated by the fact that we had social media at our disposal. Prototyping became easy. In terms of both time, we could test things and ideas very quickly, and also resources. It wasn't expensive to do it, and it wasn't really burdensome on the staff to do so. So I encouraged that sort of prototyping behavior and this culture of let's just try and see whether this works out. So eventually a strategy emerged of direct and constant interaction and involvement of our clients into our business through social media that was most convenient to them. That meant that each store had an Instagram page, a Facebook page, it had a WhatsApp phone number where clients could directly text and ask for what sizes are available, when are the new arrivals. It was convenient to them and it was certainly convenient to us. It was a much closer interaction. We involved them further by holding kind of elections for new collections and style prior to our buyers making the purchases. It was interesting to them to see what did that process look like, how did the buyers go to fashion weeks and purchase the new styles, and it was useful to us because we got feedback even before we made the purchase, so we had an idea of what our customers will prefer. Other innovative practices have evolved from this one strategy that came about, and some of them have failed and disappeared and we didn't use them over again because we didn't see that our clients like them, but a lot of them have maintained and a lot of them are currently being adapted by others in our sector. So I would say that those ones were successful. That strategy was successful because it allowed us to expand and generate and achieve our goals of increasing sales and closer communicating with our clients. So in short, let's summarize what we said today. First of all, strategic planning has impeded strategic thinking, which is a creative and intentional approach and should be induced by committing managerial style. We've looked into scenarios, which are a range of possible futures that are developed from inputs along key uncertainties and are used to generate plausible, varying, explanatory narratives. We've seen one example from KPMG on the energy industry of tomorrow. And I've also shared my personal experience of encountering both strategic planning and strategic thinking and explain to you what I believe I've done to induce the latter. Thank you very much for listening and I hope that you liked it.